Hello again, equity friends. In this second installment of the first week's content, I want to look more closely at the issue of implicit bias. Last time I used the terms explicit and implicit in a passage that I quoted from a study, but I didn't really stop to define the terms. So I'd like to take a moment and do that now. Explicit, in the sense that we're using it in this discussion, refers to a conscious choice, while implicit suggests that we may be making choices and we may be acting on unexamined or even unconscious stimuli. Now, there's a great deal of recent psychological research and literature supporting the idea of implicit biases, including groundbreaking studies conducted over the last several decades by people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. These two people actually jointly won a Nobel Prize for some of the applications of their ideas about heuristics and biases to economics. You can find out more about those heuristics and how they work in Kahneman's best-selling recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow. For our purposes, the point is that these biases are habits of mind that provide us actually with evolutionary advantages. It's impossible to stop and reason about every stimulus that our brains receive. The cave person who stopped and thought about the charging lion got eaten, while the person who bolted at the first sign of movement that might be a lion in the grass survived and passed on her genes. This person was often wrong and may have been embarrassed and made fun of for the many false alarms that she responded to. But the penalties of being wrong were unequal. Being overly cautious was embarrassing but was a survivable mistake. The opposite error was fatal. Now, this is a simplified example, of course, but the logic was similar when primitive people were choosing which other people they could trust. Family, clan, tribe, and village were all social organizations that provided protection and provided mutual aid to individuals. People benefited from group membership and were often willing to sacrifice for the group. Later, less primitive people continued taking advantage of what had basically become nearly instinctual preferences. Preferences for people we know, preferences for people who look, behave, speak like us. It's a bit surprising when you stop and really think about it that even modern nations often organize themselves in terms of racial, ethnic, language, religious, or economic or other kind of behavioral similarities. People who we don't share these defining characteristics with are often thought of as others, often distrusted. Sometimes they're even enemies. Over time, of course, this fighting for survival has changed a bit. Social structures, that is society, have made it possible, for example, for people who weren't just the strongest or the fastest or the best hunters to contribute valuable things that made it worthwhile to keep them around and to feed them and to protect them. Societies, as a result, became more diverse, with different people contributing different things. But biological evolution is a very, very slow process. And we haven't completely outgrown those automatic responses to otherness that are, to some extent, part of our hardware. The point that I'm trying to make here is that people who respond instinctively are not necessarily trying to be evil. As the 2015 study that I had quoted previously mentioned, quote, when cognitive resources are high, people are more likely to retrieve newer, explicit attitudes. When cognitive resources are low, people are more likely to retrieve initial implicit attitudes. What these psychologists are talking about there is that when we're able to be what we might call our best selves, that is controlled and reflective, then we can draw on things that we've learned about how diversity can be a good thing for our society and even for ourselves. But when we're stressed or threatened, and especially when we have to make split-second decisions, which in their words they call automatic and reactive, we're more likely to draw on more primitive instincts. And I'm calling these primitive not because they're politically incorrect and they're not woke ways that we know that we ought to subordinate our own interests to social norms, but because they are actually primitive and instinctuals. And oftentimes they're not even good for us. Rather than demonizing people for responding primitively, we might try to ask ourselves what we could do to help them to be in a place where they can be more controlled and more reflective. We might also want to admit that this type of response is human, which means that we could do it too under certain circumstances. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to be better. And this is similar, I think, to the point that Jay Smooth is making in his short video that you watched this week about the difference between doing something racist and being a racist person. We also might want to consider whether the ideas of preference and prejudice are equally problematic. That was used in one of the definitions in one of our readings this week, I think. And there is a spectrum that we live on, I think, in the modern world, between individuality on one side and group membership on another. Sometimes we value our personal freedoms, and other times we trade some of them for the benefits of being part of a family, or a clan, or a tribe, or a nation. And this is a complicated negotiation, and it's different for different people. And finally, I want to conclude by suggesting that I'm not entirely sure I agree with some of the suggestions made in some of the media that you looked at this week, that these implicit biases aren't something that we can reflect on and alter. And I don't want to push that thought on you. I would like to hear your thoughts as well. Is this something that, becoming aware of, we can change, or are we just doomed to continually fall into these traps again and again? So those are some thoughts about today's content on implicit biases. Hope you found that interesting. Let me know your thoughts in your responses, and I will see you again very soon.